As lawsuits move forward to stop President Trump's executive order to dissolve the Department of Education, Open the Books is looking into the books of the Education Department. Here to discuss their findings, what waste they're finding, is Rachel O'Brien, Deputy Public Policy Editor at OpenTheBooks.com. Welcome, of course, as always, to the National Desk. Now, you're going through everything, as you always do. What are some of the red flags that you're seeing that we as taxpayers, as voters, should be concerned about?
Yeah, so every time Open the Books does an investigation of federal agencies, the Department of Education always comes up high on the list of those needing reform. So it failed its third audit in a row. Auditors couldn't write an opinion on the department for fiscal years 2023 and 24 because of errors in the data for the department's loan programs. We talked about this recently. Employee headcounts actually decreased since 2000 by 14%, but spending rose almost 750%, from $33.5 billion to over $250 billion in 2024. So that's as around 40% of fourth graders don't meet the basic level in reading around the country. That's the largest percentage since 2002. It's just getting worse. About a third of eighth graders nationwide, they're failing their basic benchmark in reading. Also, the Department of Education, they're funding billions of dollars to Ivy League universities. We did a report recently that Ivy Leagues plus Stanford and Northwestern got $33 billion in grants and contracts from the Education Department. And these are wealthy universities. They had their endowments grow by $65 billion during that same time period. Why are taxpayers giving $33 billion to universities whose endowments grew 2 times that? So that's just the tip of the iceberg at the Department of Education.
Well, let's talk about the 750% growth, spending growth between 2000 and 2024. I mean, the first question that comes to mind is, where are they spending it on? And is it all going to the right places? There's some waste here.
Right. There's certainly waste. I mean, everyone agrees that all students should have civil protections, and that's clearly a role for the federal government. The massive loan program, that's also going to be maintained somewhere in Washington. So the Department of Education does have a role. But when you set those sorts of things aside, there's plenty of wasteful spending. There's political dogma that's getting into public schools using tax money. There's that misuse of funds is for things like DEI and gender politics in the classroom. Ohio State University, they got almost $500,000 from the Department of Ed for one specific grant, just to teach things like climate, race, and place, racial equity by design, and to have their tenure track professors do this sort of DEI research. Lots of other universities, University of Virginia, $1.6 million they got to develop a sort of, it's called a culturally and racial equity sustaining classroom assessment system. Unclear exactly what that is, but it's not going to teaching students. It's not going to helping them learn better. It's going toward political dogma that the department really should be cutting.
Well, let's talk about, just briefly, you have, of course, this executive order from President Trump directing Education Secretary Linda McMahon to shrink the Education Department as far as they can within the legal basis, because, of course, Congress has the final authority. How far do you think they'll be able to go?
Yeah, like you said, they need Congress, and they're probably not going to get that to completely get rid of it. So the president can shrink it by removing a lot of its funds and its authority. So, the workforce at the Education Department was already cut in half 2 weeks ago. That's the first step. The core federal functions are things that the administration wants to find better homes for. So, President Trump talked about moving programs for students with disabilities to HHS, moving student loans to the Small Business Administration. That he most likely does also need Congress's approval to do that. But let's be clear about what the Education Department does and doesn't do. It doesn't educate any students. And as we saw with the numbers of students not passing basic reading tests, it has not improved student achievement. The Education Department doesn't administer the school lunch program. The USDA does that. That's a misnomer. Most public school funding comes from state and local government. So the federal government provides only a small fraction of schools' overall funding, between 6 and 13%. And so since it is that small, the department could certainly use a paring down.
All right. Thanks so much, Rachel O'Brien. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.